Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Rashke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. WitchLit is brought to you by Thousand Bolt Press, a family-owned independent publisher established to produce the books we want to see in the world. Titles including Changing Past by Yvonne A. Burrow, Conjuring the Commonplace by Lane Fuller and Corey Thomas Hutchison, and my latest book, Verona Green, can be purchased directly from thousandvoltpress.com or wherever you buy books. Ashley Leavy is one of the world's top crystal healing experts and educators and author of Crystals for Energy Healing and Cosmic Crystals. Ashley's passion for crystal healing drives her role as founder and educational director of the Love and Light School of Crystal Therapy. Ashley has created dozens of award-winning online courses that are fun, educational, and life-transforming. The Love and Light School has quickly grown into a thriving international community. Ashley Leavy, welcome to WitchLit.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come talk about books and all things witchy.
Oh, awesome. So I enjoy the book and we have lots to talk about. But our first question for everyone on the show is, especially like in this age of social media and video, why still write? Why still write books?
Yeah, this is like a question I struggle with, honestly. I think about a lot. If you had told me that I would be a published author when I was a kid growing up, I would have said, no way. Writing was not something I enjoyed. It always felt like a chore. It always felt like something that was so forced. And I think it really wasn't until I started writing for myself that I found some of the joy that can be found in writing, some of the healing that can be found in reading, some of the just the way that writing can hold you. I mean, when I write, I feel held. I feel held by the universe. I feel all parts of me honored. I feel my grief. I feel my joy. And it has really become a way for me to process where I'm at in terms of my personal writing, but also to document a lot of the things that I'm doing along the way on, whatever journey I'm taking, whether that's, pursuing a deeper connection with spirit or trying to just find that place of wholeness within myself. It has become such an important part of my practice. And I often find when I'm writing, then I feel so inspired to share because it's been such a transformational process for me. I feel like, oh my gosh, like if this could get me through whatever it got me through, then I want to share it with others. I want to, offer them just a little bit of what I experienced and hope they can take that and make it their own.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's such a beautiful sentiment to you. Like, I think for me, one of the things that happened, and maybe this is your experience or if you looked into this from the beginning, but I always kind of had this bucket that my writing was separate from my spiritual practice. I don't know why. Like, I think part of it is that academic approach, because I did creative writing in college, and I think there was this academic bubble around it. And then like sometime in my early 40s, like it popped and it was like, oh no, this is who you are as a person. This is not just this separate vocation kind of thing.
I do know what you mean, because I think we're, whether it's because of academia or because of just societal views on, that writing is a job and that sort of thing, we do sometimes feel like it is separate from our spiritual practice. But I mean, truly, you put so much of yourself into your writing and into the words that you share. And I feel like that is what makes it such a deep spiritual experience, because you have to get sort of really honest with yourself and really honest about your practice. And it just becomes something that's, so much deeper than just like that occupational piece.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So I'm curious, like how your writing evolved for you, like from, so like writing for yourself, and then now you've published 2 books, and I assume all of your classes involve a lot of writing too. So like, what did that journey look like, and kind of where are you now, I guess?
Yeah, I'll be honest. If you'd asked me this question like 5 years ago, I would have thought that it hadn't changed much over the years.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just talking to a really good friend of mine, who you've actually had on the show as a guest before, Nicholas Pearson. And we were both kind of talking about, wow, it's so interesting to look back on your old writing and see how you've grown as a writer, see that journey. And when I look back at some of that old writing, I can tell that I was writing the way I thought I was supposed to be writing.
Mm-hmm.
I was writing the way that I thought people in my niche wrote about crystals. I was writing in a way that I think it really mirrored a lot of the language that was used in that niche, mirrored a lot of the concepts and ideas that was used. And, even though I had been practicing with crystals for many years before that and had been teaching for some time, it really had this specific quality that was like influenced by me, but it wasn't fully me yet.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense.
Yeah. And I feel like just in the past couple of years, I've really been able to sort of like move past that and into something that it feels more authentic to myself. And a lot of that has come from honoring my process of writing. I'm neurodivergent. I have ADHD. It can be a superpower for me, but it can also be a huge obstacle and challenge at times. And I think especially when I'm trying to like force something, when I'm not in that hyper focus where I feel excited and passionate and enthusiastic about it, that's where my writing doesn't sound like me, because it's almost like coming from this part of my brain that is going through the motions instead of being really in it and present during the process. So I think also just becoming aware of my own needs as a writer and learning how to work with that and honor that has helped that process, sort of shape up to what it is now.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, because for me, like, I feel like as my idea about why I was writing changed, like my personal practice changed around writing, and my writing also deepened at the same time. And like my thoughts about things evolved. It was all one wave of stuff. Was that true for you too?
Yeah, it's so deeply interconnected. I mean, there's no separating the writer from the writing, So as we go through life and have new experiences and kind of learn to, whether consciously or not, sort of apply that new knowledge, those new experiences to the way that we show up in our writing, it does definitely have a big impact, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we talked a little bit before about the book that I read, the Cosmic Crystals book, and just kind of like some practices in that you said you had kind of left in the past as you changed and grown. I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about that. And again, kind of like we talked about before, I just think it's so important for people to hear that, that we give ourselves grace to change, and that we give each other grace to change.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of address this. So like in the classes that I teach, my students and I have conversations about this, every single month during our live calls and stuff like that. And it's something that I don't really often get the chance to address really publicly. So just thanks for that, first and foremost. We were talking a little bit about how the book talks about the practice of smudging, which obviously is culturally appropriative, but I'll be 100% like just real and transparent and say, when this book was published, which was 2019, which means I had done a large part of the writing for it probably in 2018. I was ignorantly unaware of the issue of cultural appropriation, not just with the concept of smudging, but with so many things. I was not steeped at all or well-versed at all in anti-racism work, which is something that I've been doing deeply for a number of years now. And obviously, just to, it goes without saying, smudging is no longer a part of my personal spiritual practice. It's something that I actively try and discuss with, people who do contact me about the book or students in my classes, and not to be the figure of authority on it by any means, but to just share my personal journey in sort of trying to undo some of that harm that was caused by not just that practice, but honestly by so many things that show up in the wellness space. And being a white woman in the wellness space, I think there is so much privilege and power, and in a lot of ways, insulation from the very difficult reality that is imposed upon people of color here in the United States and abroad.
Mm-hmm.
Black folks, indigenous folks, and other people of color in general. And I think it is in some ways, embarrassing to say out loud that I literally had no awareness of so many of these issues, but it's also the truth. And the thing that's embarrassing about it is I had every opportunity to learn and never stepped into that world because I don't know what it is. I don't know if I felt like I didn't have to, if it wasn't my place, whatever. Those are still questions I'm working on answering. And I think a lot of work into, or a lot of steps into this anti-racist journey and anti-oppression journey in general. Those are things that I'm still reconciling. I'm still asking myself those questions because, as we were talking about before, that work doesn't stop. And so, it's hard to have a book out there that in some ways I am really proud of and I feel really good about and was such a big piece of me. And in other ways, has hurts attached to it, and not just my hurts. They are collective hurts. They are hurts of people of color who have suffered because of the harm done by cultural appropriation, of which I was very much a part and am still a part and am still working to unravel. So, that's a big change in the way that I sort of approach things. And so it really took a lot of figuring out, what are the steps to take here to try and remediate some of this harm. I can't undo it. I can't erase it. But what can I do? What is in my power to do going forward? So one of my very first steps was reaching out to my publisher and talking about what happens if and when this book goes for a reprint. Is there a possibility to update chapters of the book, sections of the book, that will take out some of this harmful information, but not just remove it and pretend it didn't exist, but to talk about why that change has happened. And I think that was a really important part of the piece for me. And I wouldn't have even honestly thought to consider that, except I worked with an amazing anti-racism educator and mentor, Constanza Eliana Chinea of Embody Inclusivity. And I have learned so much from her over the past few years. And she has been such a helpful person to talk to and process some of this with and figure out what is the path that moves us closer toward harm reduction and what is the path that moves us closer to collective liberation. And I am so grateful because I think without the guidance of a person of color, I couldn't even have seen the things that I was missing. And I hope that answers the question, but
no, it does. And I think about, it just made me think some about my own journey with that. I think it's easy to walk into the kind of like the kind of new agey wellness, spiritual space. And it's, it is love and light, like your school name. And it is this like place. And then when you start to really look at it, when you do kind of have that realization that, oh, there's some not great stuff too. It's hard. I mean, that was the door I walked into, I guess the occult space was through that kind of new age approach. And I'm not thinking about the cultural theft and appropriation that had happened for a lot of that until later. And my husband, and I've said this on the podcast, and I try not to make it a drinking game, but my husband is from Trinidad. We had a conversation very early in our relationship, and he said, being in an interracial relationship is a public act, basically. And are you ready for that? And at the time, I was like, yeah, sure. Dear listener, I did not really know what that was going to be. And, one of the things that we've really discussed is like, it's not his job as my husband to educate me on this. It's my job to educate me on this. And thankfully, we have very frank, open conversations about everything, including, anti-racism and all of this stuff. But yeah, the journey never ends. And it is embarrassing when you realize, like, when you've said things that you learn later, like the harm that caused, and you're just like, but again, I think, shutting down and saying, I don't want to deal with the uncomfortableness. I don't want to deal with the embarrassment isn't really an option. So it is like being open and public about it. And just, like you said, continuing the journey, because I'll be doing this work the rest of my life. Hopefully. I mean, that's the goal, right? Is that we just continue to move toward a collective liberation. Like, to me, that is like, I really, in my heart, believe we're not free until we're all free. And that's all of our work.
100%. And it really is. It's so interesting looking back and asking some of those questions, like, how did this come about? And when I think back to my experience, I very much exactly can relate to what you're saying. Came in through that sort of like new age metaphysical sort of door into the wellness space. And was at a time in my life where I was really seeking that connection with spirit, really looking for answers to big questions that I had, and was learning a lot that was in many ways serving me very well, was supporting me. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't at the same time harmful to other people. And, when I think like, how did I miss this? How did I not know? How was I so completely unaware? Well, if I'm like looking at things through the lens that I have now, all of my teachers were white folks. A majority, if not all, the books I was reading were written by white folks. And, it's because of these systemic issues that it is so easy for white people of privilege to be able to close ourselves off from the reality of what's happening in the world. And, it is embarrassing, but sitting in that discomfort and finding ways to work through that discomfort so that we can do better is so important. And, I have days where I want to sort of shut down and not think about things or not do that work, but reminding myself that I personally do have the privilege to indulge in that and indulge that part of myself if I want to, but that people of color do not have that privilege. And so reminding myself that is part of the work as a white person is to sort of fight against that urge to be complacent. So thanks for just having a really open conversation about that, because I think it's so easy to fall into. And a lot of folks are, I think, having these conversations, a lot of white folks, I should say, are having these conversations more and more, but we need to keep having them. Yeah. We need to keep having them over and over.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of folks who are like, oh, we had this conversation around the George Floyd uprising, and then everybody kind of went back to sleep. And I was like, yeah. And, I think if you look at things only from an online perspective, I think there was this like social media, I have to be. And I mean, I posted stuff too. Like, I'm not going to pretend like I didn't participate in that, but it's, that performative work is not as important to me as the actual work. And I think that's hard. And I think about, like, especially with like social media, it's very easy to be performative and not really do the work. And I think it's a trap that it's real easy to fall into, even if you are doing the work or trying to do the work, that, my post, and you're like, is that really doing anything? Like, I don't know. And I think when you have a public platform, I mean, you are a published author, you have a podcast too, like there's also this call to say, well, why aren't you speaking on this? And I'm like, because I'm not a voice that you need to hear speak about this. That's kind of, and yet there is this space that we feel like my podcast is not like a massive listenership podcast. My platform is, like a half inch above the ground, but people still ask. And I'm like, nothing I say is going to contribute to the discourse on this. I'm learning as things are happening. I can tell you that I think violence against non-combatants is not good. I can tell you these things that I have, but I can't talk about the politics of the situation because I'm not the voice you need to listen to about it.
You know what? I love that you said that. There, Black Liturgies on Instagram recently had a post kind of saying sort of just this, like, mirroring this, that sometimes, especially like as white folks, but for anyone, we need to ask ourselves if we always need to be the loudest voice in the room or if we need to be a voice in the room at all.
Right.
And sometimes there is a place for our silence so that the voices that matter most in a given situation can rise above the noise and the chatter and the everything. And that really made such a strong impact on me hearing that. And also, I go back to a lot of the things that I've been putting into practice the past few years. And one of, I think the most important things that I've learned is that this work has to be done in community.
Mm-hmm.
And this work is not, I mean, there are certain things, of course, that we need to be doing on the individual level, but overall, this work needs to be done in community. And coming back to that reminder, I think is so important, because when we are doing the work only by ourselves, we miss out on so much because of our own internal biases, because of our lived experience, and how that differs and varies from the lived experience of the collective of humanity. And so reminding myself, like you said, that not everything has to be super public facing. We can have the things that we do personally. We can have the things that we do that involve our closest relations, our friends, our family. We can do the things that involve our community members, our neighbors. And then there are the public calls to action and the public speaking, and all of it is important, but not all of it necessarily has a place in every single situation. We have to figure out where that right time, right place is. And a lot of that involves some self-awareness about our motivations behind our actions and what we're doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The motivations part. I think to me, that's part. I mean, when we talk about shadow work, to me, that's one of the things is like, the shadow is not just the dark part of yourself. It's also the underpinning of the part you show. So I don't know. It's, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there always. And I just thank you too for being open to talk about it, because I think it's just, we are having this conversation publicly, right? I mean, that is part of it, but it's so important to just, I think, yes, to do it in community. And part of that, community is to call each other in and out about things. And, I mean, I don't know. I always hesitate to weigh into the cancel culture discussion because I think it's taken on a whole extra political level that really doesn't have anything to do with like how it impacts actual humans.
Sure.
But what I see it as, like, the roots of it are saying, hey, by the way, did you know that this thing you're doing is harmful? And giving someone the opportunity to correct or change direction or say, thank you. I thank you for pointing that out to me, and I will work to correct that. Instead of just saying, you are no longer a person to me. That's not what that's supposed to be. And
that's the part, like you just said, and give them a chance to correct that. Right. Like, I think and we could, oh my gosh, we could have such a discussion about cancel culture and the act of canceling, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, and what I'm probably going to get things wrong here when I say this, but a lot of times, most of the time, I think people are given a lot of grace. And it's when that listening, reflecting, and responding to correct the harm doesn't happen,
Mm-hmm.
that the cancel happens. You know what I mean?
Yeah, if you're going to double down when you're called out, or if I was going to double down if I get called out, I mean, I can't exclude myself from this conversation, and I want to make that really clear that I do not think I am perfect in any way. If you double down, or I double down, or you double down, or whoever, then that's a whole different conversation. Like, that changes the game, because then that tells me that you're entrenched in that thought, or that's an entrenched thought I have, and I need to examine that.
Yeah.
But
and I do, I'll just be vulnerable. I'll say, like, it's a scary thing being called out. It's a scary thing. Because I think, we're all humans,
mm-hmm.
and sometimes we make the initial mistake, right? Whatever it was. And then we make the mistake of being human and reacting instead of
Mm-hmm.
responding, because we want to fix it, or we want to defend ourselves, or we want to whatever, or talk about our intentions instead of our impact, like all those things, right? And I think that on the one hand, that's very human, but and I'm, I know I have done this in my life. I 100% know that I've done this.
Me too.
But also, like, I think that is a big part of this work, is trying to learn how to respond rather than react, and how to take that accountability. And accountability looks different to everyone. It feels different to everyone, especially based on who has been impacted and how they've been impacted and what harm has been caused, and what you can do to repair or reduce that harm going forward. But I think that there is, like you said, such an opportunity to give people grace to try and correct those mistakes, and learn from them, and not make those mistakes again. I think that's what's extra hard too, when we see people make those same mistakes over and over and over again, like myself included, like, it's something that I think I often, like, find myself reflecting on, or thinking about, oh, how might I respond in this situation? And I think we can't know until we're in it. And I think one of the hardest things is, in some ways, sort of like finding the way to really take that accountability, to really stand up and try and reduce that harm, and try and remedy the situation as best you can. Because the thing is, you can never make it go away. You can never necessarily take it back. And that gets hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a human response. I think especially in Western culture, like, critique and criticism becomes so personal, and not, like, I think that's why what you said about it being in community is so important. Someone who cares enough about you to call out what you've done, like, that's an act of love to do that, because it is labor on their part. It's emotional pain on their part to call you out and say, hey, by the way, did you know you did this thing? That's confrontation is hard for everyone. And I think to look at it as an act of love of ourselves and our community, and to not make it, we're so individualistic in the West, especially. And I think it's to look at it in this more, like, community collective way, kind of softens that a little bit. If you can think of, I mean, in the moment, I'm going to say in the moment, it's hard to do, but, in reflection, to look at it, like you said, in community, in this collective progress, that's really, I think, a way to maybe not be so hard on ourselves, because we can't change the fact that we were born into a culture and we were acculturated in this culture. And we have to just work through that and work past those things.
Okay, out of everything we've talked about so far today, this is going to be one of those things that sticks with me for a really long time, because that was so beautiful, that like a call out or a call in is an act of love. And thinking about, also the impact on that person who's having that conversation, or those community members who are having that conversation. I feel that in my bones. Like that is an ultimate act of love. It's an act of kindness, really.
Mm-hmm. Because if you don't matter to that person, and the shitty thing you did is just another shitty thing they have to deal with in their day, you're not worth having that conversation with. True. To them, to that person. Or so, yeah, like it really shifted my focus on it. And I mean, honestly, I have my husband to thank for that. Like that shift in, I cannot say I came to this on my own. Like I have him to thank for kind of that reflection on that.
That's beautiful.
Awesome. Oh, Ashley. I feel like we went way deeper than I thought we were going to go. And I really appreciate your candor and your openness. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for this conversation.
Yeah. It feels weird. I want to kind of wrap it back around to writing and kind of like how, like, I think it does, when your lenses shift, everything shifts. So like for you, like in your writing process now, like how, like, I mean, are you working on another book? Like how are you bringing that, I guess, into fruition? And I know you're teaching a lot. So I know it's showing up in that way too.
Yeah. So this is like a painful subject, but again, like full transparency, I feel like, I don't know, you've created such a safe space for conversation here. So I am not currently writing another book. After I wrote the last book, and after the pandemic started, I honestly went through probably the deepest depression of my life. And I have not really spoken openly or publicly about this very much. And not because I don't think that we should share it, but because I was so deep in it, I couldn't talk about it. I just didn't have the emotional strength. And it was really difficult. It went on for a couple years, and it honestly truly wasn't until the beginning of this year, 2023, obviously because we're recording in October, that I started to feel more like myself again. And it probably wasn't until the early summer of this year, that I really did feel like myself again.
Yeah.
And, I know we all go through times where we're struggling, where things are difficult, where things ebb and flow. But I felt like I could barely do the things I needed to do in a day, let alone the thought of something as big as a book. Because I will say, although I enjoy the writing process, it is also a huge challenge for me. I mean, it's not easy, right? I mean, I'm sure most people would agree it's not easy for the most part. There are those times where it feels like everything is flowing and you're so in it, and you just are feeling it, and it does feel kind of easy in those moments. But overall, the process, at least for me, has always been rather difficult, and trying to like organize my thoughts during that time just couldn't have happened for me. And it's just been over the past few months that I've been thinking that I have another book in me. And it's really been born out of, at least this idea has been born out of the things that felt grounding and healing for me during that really rough time in my life, which for me was a seasonal practice of connecting with the land, being really tapped into the slowness of the seasons and honoring what each season brought. Where I live here in Madison, Wisconsin, we have a very clear 4 seasons, of which winter makes up about half of the year.
Yeah.
But I feel the need to start to go back through my journals and go back through some of the things that were really healing for me, and start to organize my thoughts around that time as much to document some of those practices that really served me well as to reflect on what that time in my life was like. And I can feel that if this does sort of turn into a book about, working with crystals for seasonal practice, I feel like it will be a much more personal, much more intimate book. My last two books have been a bit more how to, in a lot of ways. There are ideas for rituals and things that were compiled from journals and little scraps of paper and things that I had done in my own practice. But I feel like this is more about the journey of the year and looking at, each year in our life and how it's, even though it's a year, it's sort of a moment in time.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's something there, and I really hope to start that process soon. I'm feeling it out and trying to be gentle with myself through that process, which is different for me, I think. Like you were talking about earlier in the show, there was a time where like writing was very much like more academic or tied to a career, or it was a specific thing. And I think I don't want to push, even though I feel this book in me, I feel like I want to share it. I don't want to rush into a commitment with capitalism at the moment.
Yeah. No, I get that a lot. Oh, I get that on a deep level. Yeah, I think, and it has come up with other folks on the show previously about the the core pandemic time, like early on, just there was a reason you couldn't get a therapist. Like everybody was dealing with so much stuff. And for some people, that was a really rich time because they stepped out of time and kind of reset. But it was hard for me to, I felt so disconnected from everything. And it just, creativity, in the beginning, I kind of felt ramped up, oh, we have this time and this opportunity. And you were seeing people, there are dolphins in the canals in Venice, things seemed like, even though it was horrible what was going on, that we were also seeing that there was another way possible. And then as things kind of got back to normal, that was actually a harder time for me to go, but we're wasting this opportunity to really, really step back and look at what works for us and what doesn't. And I think that, that was to, burn the engines of capitalism, right? Is to get things back to normal.
Right.
Which wasn't great. None of us really were thrive. I say none of us. Obviously, people thrive in all environments. I was not thriving. And I think a lot of people weren't thriving in this kind of rat race approach to things. And it happened, I think, even when, it's interesting to me, in the occult space or the wellness space, and when you step into the public part of it, or you step into the business part of it, it can really change your relationship with your own practice in a way that I think can be really negative. It just, again, it takes on this performative aspect, right? And that's part of this. I can't remember if this is in the recording. I had an interview recently, but I think it was when we were talking after, so I think it's not in the recording, but I had seen somewhere that basically social media turns all of our phones into narcissist mirror.
Wow. Yeah.
And it struck me so hard. And I really wish I could remember where I saw it, because I need to credit the person who said it. But it's it's so hard to step away from that. And because we were also isolated, online became such a lifeline for people to be connected. So, I think so many people's creativity, writing, artists, everybody, it's weird. Either it was the most fertile time in their creative life, or things just shut down.
You know what? I totally know what you're talking about, because I feel like those first couple months, even though it was scary, it was horrible. People were sick. People were dying. It was awful. At the same time, there was a weird thing happening, at least here in the United States. I know it was very different elsewhere, but we had stimulus checks, for part of that. Some people had paid leave. A lot of people did not, right? There are a lot of working class people left without any source of income, which was really scary. But a lot of people were, their places of business were shut down and maybe they were eligible for unemployment benefits or whatever. So simultaneously, as all this horrible stuff was happening in the earth, there was also this weird mini renaissance happening in a lot of ways. And I feel like it reminds me of that meme that's like so popular, and I'm going to really badly paraphrase it, but it's something like, about like how a lot of like wealthy people's children go on to have careers in the arts, like writing or painting or making music or whatever. And like, how nice would it be if we could all just kind of follow our creative passion and do the thing that we felt so inspired by? And I feel like for that little blip in time, a lot of people did that. A lot of people
saw a glimpse of it, what it could look like. Yeah.
Yeah. They got to stick a toe in at least. And there were some really beautiful things being created out of that time. And, some of them were rooted in pain and grief, and some of them were able to finally be expressed because people had a little bit of space, just like a tiny bit of space.
Yeah.
And it's so weird to think about that time when, there were such varied lived experiences for people. But then I immediately, like very much like what you said, as things started to open back up and there was this like pursuit and rush to kind of fuel commerce again and, quote unquote, get back to normal, it left me with such a deep sadness. And, I work from home, which in so many ways is a huge privilege and especially was at that time. And, I had the privilege of being relatively safe and things like that. But it was also so isolating. And I think even as things started to open back up, I don't know what your experience was like, but I was very cautious for a long time. I own a crystal shop here in Madison, and we did not open to the public until I think it was October of 2021. And even then we were open by appointment only. And I don't think we reopened our store until July of 22.
Yeah.
It was a long time. And all the other businesses up and down, like our downtown where we are, we're all open. But it was like a collective decision that we made as a team on when we felt safe and when we didn't. And I said, you know what, we will keep doing what we want to do with no pressure until we all agree that, we feel safe or not. And, it's really, I think there's something kind of heartbreaking about that experience too, of like you said, so many people got to see sort of a glimmer. And I think of all the books that have gone unwritten and the art that's gone uncreated because there was this push to, get back to the status quo.
I think, like all the people we lost in that, either you did not survive COVID or whose lives were changed forever by COVID. And like, it reminds me, it's not, I think, the stark disappearance of like during the height of the AIDS epidemic, when I always think of that picture of the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir. I don't know if you've seen it online, where it's like 4 or 5 people in white shirts and everybody else in black shirts. And the people in white shirts are the people that survived of this huge chorus of men. But I think about that too. I mean, knowing people who did not survive COVID and knowing people whose lives have been changed by COVID personally, and just how their lives have shifted so much because of that. And like, it's, it's that, may you live in interesting times thing. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not fun. So it's just getting through that and trying to find it. But I feel like I will also say I was lucky enough to find a therapist to work through some of that stuff because it hit really hard. And I, being someone who's kind of a hermit anyway, that whole experience made it really easy for me to really dig in and kind of, even though there was isolation for safety, there was also isolation out of fear at some point too. And so it was really, I think it's a lot to work through, and it affects your ability to, connect to like your practice spiritually and your practice as a writer. And it's a lot. So I think, I feel like people are talking about it, which is good. Because I think, again, like you said, these are things that we need to share, because if like one person listens to this podcast and feels heard, then yay, or seen, yay. Because, I don't think we go through many things alone.
Yeah.
Or at least
I can tell you, I relate to your story so much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was very much my experience. And in a lot of ways, my writing practice, although there were gaps in time where
Mm-hmm.
I didn't pick up a pen, there were a lot of times where I really do think that my writing practice sort of saved me. And one of the things that, and it wasn't, writing for anyone but me. It was
Mm-hmm.
mostly a journaling practice, which I really thought I had done in the past, but really what I had done in the past was like a documenting practice.
Yeah.
And a journaling practice, a true like creative, free flowing journaling practice was so much different. And, I'm just going to share it. So I don't know if you are familiar with Bridget's Grove, but the company founder, Molly Reamer, has the most amazing journals that I really connect with. They're called 30 Days of Goddess. But they're meant to be a way to connect with Goddess in your practice. And for me, that takes the shape of universe or goddess or whatever, like I'm feeling connected to at the moment, the land often. But it's just the simplest little 1-page journal. And it felt like no pressure. There's a little space to record like the moon phase and your mood and whatever you want. And there's a 1-word prompt for the day. And sometimes I would follow that prompt and be a little bit inspired by it, or it would make me reflect on my day in a different way. And sometimes, I wouldn't really think about that prompt at all. But giving myself that space to just write a little bit on 1 page every day without the pressure to fill the page, without the pressure to have to do it every single day, but knowing that that practice would be there for me whenever I needed it, and being able to turn to something to make sense of everything that was going on and the things that I was feeling and the deep grief and those feelings of isolation and all those things. That was a way of exploring writing that I truly had never done before, and allowing myself space to be brutally honest about my feelings and how I was showing up or how I was hiding because of fear. So just sometimes not showing up, and just getting to hold space for all of me in that practice is something that I am so grateful for in my life. And it wasn't until pretty recently that I realized what an important part of my spiritual practice that had become. And I have these chunks of time where I look back through my old journals, and there are 3 months or 6 months without a single entry. And then there might be a flurry of things. And that really speaks volumes too. Sometimes it's not the writing we're doing, but the writing that we're not doing that shines a little light.
That shines a light on what's going on. Yeah. Because of what you do, I did want to ask you, because I think, it's not an advice show necessarily. I mean, we mostly just talk about writing and magic and witchy stuff, but I did want to ask you, like, what do you recommend for writers, like, to have on their desk or with them, like, either to open those channels when they're blocked or as a companion, or like, what kind of stones do you recommend to people when they ask you?
I love this question. This was so unexpected, but I love this. Okay. So I love rainbow fluorite, or really any type of fluorite. I used to really prefer rainbow fluorite, which some of the most beautiful rainbow fluorite comes out of China. But I've really been working with a lot of British minerals for the past 2 years, and the Rogerly mine fluorite, which is this beautiful forest green, and it has this really cool cubic structure. I love that for mental clarity.
Mhm.
There's something about it that just helps me get more focused. I feel really inspired by it. And it's almost like, you know how like there are certain scents and fragrances that can like really trigger a memory or something like that. Like my mom always says the smell of rose reminds her of the soap in my great grandma's bathroom. So it was her
Oh,
grandma
yeah.
when she was
Mhm.
growing up. You
Yeah.
know, there are those little things. For me, building a relationship with a really particular crystal and sort of working in community with that crystal can be really supportive the same way, and just helping me shift my energy into a particular space.
Mhm.
So if there's something that I really need to focus on, if it's writing an article or an outline for a class or whatever it is, um, working with that Rogerly fluorite for some clarity and some focus, I find just gets me in the space where I'm able to sit down and do what I need to do. Um, but for motivation and creativity, I love carnelian. I feel like it has this vibrant, fiery energy. It really kind of stirs up your passions and that creative idea formation. And
Mhm.
although it's, in my opinion, at least, or my experience, it's not so much about the creative expression. It's about the like churning over and stirring up of all those things that are sort of sitting within you, waiting to sort of come to the surface. And sometimes that's where the fluorite comes in handy, because it
Mhm.
helps me make sense of all those thoughts and all
Yeah.
those things that I'm feeling. But that's like my favorite duo.
Oh, nice. I love that. I before we started recording, I showed Ashley what's on my desk. So I have this giant piece of gold tiger's eye that I love. And for me, it is kind of that clarity kind of stone. And then the other chunk I have on my desk is this piece of Amazonite, because 1,000 years ago, I can't even tell you who told me that Amazonite was good for writers. And I bought a piece. And so I have it on my desk. So,
I can see that the Amazonite really does tap into that like creative expression piece and like communicating our ideas. And the golden tiger's eye, definitely a great clarity stone, and focus. It really is strongly connected with the air element. So we have that going for it.
mhm.
I love that combo.
Yeah. And I have so, like, my chart is so watery. So I always feel like it's good to kind of help bring in some of those other elements. I don't have a lot of earth in my chart. So it's nice to kind of have some grounding. And it's funny. I was telling Ashley again before we were recording that I never really think of myself as somebody who works with crystals a lot, but I was a rock hound as a kid. And like I took geology in college because I didn't want to cut up frogs. It was a lab science, and just fell in love. Like I just fell in love with geology and that. And I've always thought of, I guess, it in almost like a scientific way. It was interesting because in your book you talk about, I think, your dad and his love of rocks, or your granddad. I can't remember which one. Your grandpa, and just kind of his love of rocks, like from the scientific point of view, like, or like a rock hound kind of person.
Yeah, he was a
And
chemical engineer. So he was like into the hard science.
yeah, yeah. And so I think it's interesting that you can approach them in different ways. And like I love, thinking of kind of like always rethinking, like, why do I do things, you know?
Yes.
So I like
Yeah.
that.
The thing that got me into rocks was like truly the mythology and lore and
Mhm.
history and how they'd been worked with throughout history, at least
Um,
throughout written history that we know of. And for me, that like opened this whole new world
mhm,
into, because I had such a love of I shouldn't say had, but even as a kid, had such a love of mythology and legend and lore, and
mhm.
um, seeing how crystals fit into that was like a way of connecting with them that was really concrete. Like you can't reach out and touch a myth, but you can reach out and touch a crystal that was in a
Yeah.
myth.
And it's funny, you brought up Nicholas earlier. And when I interviewed him, we talked about the fact that we kind of forget that, like, everything we're surrounded with comes from the earth.
Yes.
Like, the computer that we're using to talk to each other, our fancy podcast mics, the desk I'm sitting next to, all of the stuff is of the earth. And we just kind of forget about that sometimes. And I think as an animist, like that's kind of important to remember that, even though it is so easy to just get caught up in the day to day and kind of forget that, these things have their own spirit and purpose.
Yeah. And finding new ways to recognize and honor that in our practice.
Yeah. I love that. Well, we try to keep it to an hour, and I think you and I went over, but I don't care because this conversation's been great. But I did, before we do our game of chance question, I did want to give you an opportunity to just plug what's coming up. Like I said, this will come out at the end of January. So let people know where to find you and what you got on offer, I guess.
Yeah. If you've enjoyed the conversation and you want to like chat me up with anything you want to reflect on, anything like that, I always love getting DMs on Instagram. I know not everybody likes it, but I really enjoy that conversation. So you can find me on Instagram at Love and Light School. And in just a couple weeks from when this podcast is released, I'll be opening enrollment for my crystal healing certification program, which I do a couple times a year. So you can learn more specifically about the program at crystalhealerschool.com. Or if you're looking for some great free resources, I have tons of articles and videos and podcast episodes and free classes on my website at loveandlightschool.com.
Awesome. Great. So all the guests, and for listeners, all the guests get the questions ahead of time, but they do not get this last question because I write them for each guest. So I am going to roll a die, and depending on what I get, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. Those lovely, dark things we're not supposed to talk about or whatever. Right. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one you want. And I would say there's not really any rules to this game. So if we get a question, I'm like, no, I don't want to talk about that. We'll roll it again.
Okay, let's go for it.
The 3, religion.
Woo!
So one of the things I enjoyed in your book is you mentioned that, this wasn't in your book. It was an interview that I read online that you had given about your family when you were younger really encouraged you to go experience a lot of different religions, to go to a temple, to go to mass, to go, to do all these things and really experience that. How do you feel like that echoes in your practice today? That having been given almost permission to explore as a kid?
Yeah, I think it's had good and bad consequences, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll start with like the things that like looking through the lens I have now weren't great. I think like growing up in the time and place that I did, there wasn't a lot of context given for whether or not it may be appropriate for me to be in all of those spaces. So although I think it was, a great, there was great intention behind allowing for the kids in our family to choose a spiritual path or religious affiliation or whatever that resonated with them and that felt like was meaningful to them and that wasn't necessarily like pushed on us in any way. We were really encouraged to explore. Obviously, yeah, there are some things like that may not have been, that could have been better with more guidance. I'll put it that way. Yeah. Because I do think that a lot of that, eclectic, for lack of a better word, this is the word a lot of people use in the witchcraft community, approach to connecting with spirit made me feel like I had permission to draw from a lot of places when I didn't always. Yeah. So that's been a big learning experience for me just over these past few years. But I think in many ways, it's also the thing that I'm so grateful for is that my mom never made anything off limits in terms of what was accepted by her and what would be accepted by our family. Yeah. So even though that was so different than, a lot of my friends growing up and schoolmates and things like that, it was it was something that I always appreciated, knowing that I had that freedom. As a Sagittarius, that freedom piece is pretty important to me. So feeling like I could explore and have different experiences and see how that fit in was really important for me. And thinking about how that sort of shaped my practice now, I think in a way, even though I've made a lot of pit stops along the way, it has helped me find my way home. It's helped me rediscover what's important to me in my practice, and primarily, again, this connection to the land, this connection to nature, to spirit, and to being in tune with this like seasonal practice and understand how I'm not separate from things outside of myself, how we are the same.
Yeah.
And that has been such a beautiful gift in my life and something that I'm really grateful for. And that, my mom got a lot of flack for that from grandparents and stuff like that. My mom was raised Methodist. So when we weren't baptized, we weren't confirmed, we didn't have a regular church we went to. We went to church a few times, so we could have the experience. But like you mentioned, we went to Baha'i temple, we went to synagogue, we went to Catholic mass, we went to Vedic temple. There were just a lot of options. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. So we had a lot of options to explore. And it wasn't until I was about 15 or 16, though, that I kind of discovered paganism and witchcraft and explored it for a little bit and thought at that time it wasn't for me, and left the idea of that practice behind for a long, long, long time. And I think it wasn't until probably just 4 or 5 years ago that I really started to realize that everything that I was doing in my practice was very witchcraft centric. And it was an interesting realization because I just really thought that was something that wasn't for me. And then I'm like, wait, you know what? Actually, I think
it was witchcraft all along.
Yeah, it was witchcraft all along. Exactly. Like it was like, in Scooby-Doo when they take the mask off the villain and it's like, hey, surprise. Like that's what was there. And it felt in some ways good to recognize like what was in my heart and like sort of where my feet were planted, so to speak. But in other ways, like I still really don't like to label it. Like, would I say that I'm a witch? Like, I suppose so. I don't know that it's like a word I would often use to self-describe. I think it in my head, but it's not something I don't know, speak out loud. And like, I don't, in terms of like a collective umbrella under paganism, like I'm sure I fall somewhere under there, but, I don't have like a specific way I think about it or specific way I label it. And I think a lot of that comes back to that need for a bit of freedom and a need for a sort of formless space for my practice to exist in.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's funny you say that about like identifying in your head as a witch and then not really talking about it that way. Like I did that for a long time. I mean, my reasons were a little different because I just wasn't, I don't know that I was ever 100% like in the broom closet, scare quotes that people can't see. But I was in Tennessee. I grew up in Tennessee. I lived in Tennessee for years. And though there is a very rich pagan community there, a witchcraft community there, bless them because lifelines in so many ways. But just I was always, I was raised in the South. You don't want to offend people. You don't want to, so it was just like always kind of kept to myself. And I won't say that it was 100% moving to California and being like, oh, I can kind of, it was really more getting older.
Yes.
And just saying, like what other people think about me is not as important as what I think about myself and how I identify and what I need. And, like I try not to like rub people's face in, although like it's pretty obvious on my social media and I have a podcast where I talk to people who talk about witchcraft. So like it's out there, but I never just like threw open the doors and went, by the way, I'm a witch.
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. You know what? I never thought about that piece of just aging into the comfort of it.
Mm-hmm.
But wow. Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. It's been, I have to say, like, again, a second drinking game for the show. I turned 50 last year. And yes, I am obsessed with it, but not in the way that people like. I'm not like, I wasn't scared to turn 50 or sad about it. I was like kind of excited that I made it. It was, my sister is 10 years older than I am. And so I've always kind of had this person ahead of me kind of trailblazing. Like, so aging has not been scary for me because I see how she handles it with such grace. And it's just, here's the things. But she said, like, when you hit 35, you just stop caring what people think. It took me longer than that. I mean, it clicked in a little bit in my 30s, but it really wasn't until I was in my 40s where it was really like, is it really important? And I mean, I still have those moments where, I mean, everybody wants to be liked. I mean, I'm not going to say I have turned into like a true bog witch and I have no shits to give about what anybody thinks about me. But it's less important as long as I'm in integrity with myself.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Wow.
Awesome.
It has been so great talking to you today, getting to know you a little bit better. Like, I think all of us get to know you a little bit just from listening to the podcast, but it's really great to just be able to have these conversations. And thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. And, just for your candor and your wisdom and your generosity and your time for being on the show. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Julian Rashke. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shenekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Threads at witchlitpod. Please help other witches find us by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to and reading WitchLit.